Under the guidance of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, this summit has become a major global platform to discuss how governments can evolve and become more agile and citizen-centered and face the challenges of tomorrow. The OECD has been a strategic partner for the UAE in the framework of the summit. Since 2013, we have helped to define characteristics of the governments of tomorrow, building on the role of the OECD as a hub for global governance, but also on our growing relations with the UAE and the Arab world through our MENA OECD initiative. I am thus very pleased that we are launching the report, Achieving Cross-Border Government Innovation, Delivering and Enabling Impactful Cross-Border Solutions here today. Today, more than ever, governments must embrace continuous change to be resilient in the face of adversity. Since the onset of the COVID-19 crisis, governments around the world have unleashed innovation at a pace and scale not seen in generations. However, the crisis has exposed several shortcomings and reinforced pre-existing vulnerabilities. At the national level, it has revealed a lack of preparedness among governments to tackle global challenges, with only half of OECD countries having dedicated institutions in place tasked with identifying novel, unforeseen, or complex crises. At a global level, the pandemic has also highlighted how the increasing interconnectedness of countries may have made the world more vulnerable to common threats and has exposed weaknesses in international cooperation. In my view, demonstrating that we are collectively able to tackle the global challenges of our time is essential to reinforce public trust in government. As witnessed during the pandemic, innovation is a key tool to address today's most pressing global challenges. However, government innovation efforts today are largely confined to national or local borders. Why is collaborating across borders not happening more often? And how can we break this paradigm? The OECD Observatory of Public Sector Innovation and the UAE Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Government Innovation have worked in partnership over the last year to determine which set of innovative practices governments can adopt to best support cross-border collaboration. In October, we launched the first in a series of 3 reports on governing cross-border challenges, which shows the need for new government mechanisms for international cooperation to manage today's complex challenges. In November, we launched a second report on surfacing insights and experimenting across borders. The report showcases how governments have employed creative and novel methods to bring forth new thinking and test potential innovative solutions to cross-border challenges such as climate change and infectious disease. Today, we are excited to be with our partners in the UAE government to launch a third and final report on delivering and enabling impactful cross-border solutions. Hands-on delivery and implementation is where the rubber meets the road. It represents the culmination of the different types of initiatives, structures, and mechanisms uncovered by our joint work. Governments are putting in place cross-border enablers, such as interoperable data sharing and cross-border skills, to allow for collective design and implementation of innovative policies and services. All of the reports in this series feature case studies, best practices, tools, resources, and recommendations to help governments make progress in surfacing and testing new ideas across borders. For instance, the report we are launching today includes case studies on the X-Road Trust Federation between Estonia and Finland, the first cross-border data sharing ecosystem of its kind, facilitating the real-time availability of interoperable data. The UAE's Government Experience Exchange Program, a cross-border development and modernization program that the UAE offers to governments around the world to share knowledge, skills, and experience with a view to building public sector innovation capacities at global levels. Finally, and critically, none of this work could have been achieved without the support in collaboration with our partners in the UAE. Over the last 6 years, we have worked together to analyze and synthesize, finding around thousands of innovative practices from all parts of the world, and we produced 11 reports on critical innovation trends and topics. Through this work, the UAE has stepped up to serve as global leaders in innovation in their own right for other governments seeking to transform themselves.
I'd like to start by highlighting the importance of our collaboration with the OECD. I think you mentioned that, but from the UAE's perspective, we've been collaborating in many different perspectives, innovation being one, but also gender balance, taxation, and of course, agility. I think this has resulted in a remarkable amount of work that we are proud of, and we have collaborated together, and it's only the beginning. The world is fast changing, and the key areas that we need to look at will also determine where we will take this forward. I think our relationship, if I was to zoom in more early on, is the one where we looked at with the Mohammed bin Rashid Center for Government Innovation and the Observatory for Public Sector Innovation, OPSI, OECD. A few years ago, at the World Government Summit, we looked at what could be the future trends in innovation. And we said either we do it in-house and we look at it internally and we do that report, or we actually innovate how we develop that report, and hence the birth of the collaboration we had with OECD. And that was a call-out, a global call-out to countries all over the world to tell us what are their key innovations. And that call-out resulted in hundreds and hundreds of interesting case studies that we've been privileged to have access to. And those case studies we reviewed annually, and we looked at what are the common themes that came out in that year. And not only did we bring it to life on the reports, we brought it to life with the Edge of Government, an experiential exhibition that highlighted the cases from around the world that governments should really keep a close eye on. And what we looked at was not the ones that were published, was the ones that were below the radar. And that's really hard to find, because it's the ones that are truly innovating are the ones that are not really worrying about publishing. They're actually worrying about doing the work. And those are the ones that we were searching for together. And I really want to thank OECD over the years, where we were able to gather all of these brilliant case studies. And we have some of them with us today as well. 2 years ago, though, our approach changed. We zoomed into the COVID, and of course, the world changed 2 years ago. So we looked at what are the interesting, resilient governments around the world that are co-creating with the private sector on truly remarkable innovations. And so our reports then zoomed into the COVID innovations, and we published 5 very strong reports that we're very proud of on that, embracing COVID, and how do we learn from that experience, not just in COVID times. We hope, inshallah, this is behind us. We're still in it, but we hope that we learn from that experience with potentially anything else that comes our way. How important it is for governments to be agile, but how important it is for governments to have cross-border collaboration. Hence came to this year's report, and this year zoomed into cross-border collaboration. Because if anything, the pandemic told us that there's no borders when it comes to pandemic. And similarly, there are no borders when it comes to climate change, and there are no borders when it comes to poverty. So in that, we zoomed into that area, and we looked at the report, and to bring to life countries and governments and institutions that work together to really collaborate together. And we know it's harder. It's harder when you go beyond governments. It's hard when you're doing it within government, but imagine how much harder it is when you go beyond different governments and different regulatory frameworks. So those are the truly remarkable cases that we brought to light today, and hopefully with our questions we can talk more about that.
Why did you embark on this work, and why is cross-border innovation even important for governments?
Well, I think we started off looking at sort of innovation in the public sector because if you want to have meaningful change, one of the biggest challenges you face in governments, having worked for the US government for many years, is that governments are often in the mindset of, well, that's the way we've always done it. And it's breaking out of that mold, and sort of the other adage is, if it's not working, you say, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. and getting government to break that habit is really important. I think that even though we knew it from the area of the work we've done that you mentioned, the tax environment and reaching the agreement of 139 countries on a new global approach to taxation, that's an area where clearly you needed it and it forced you to look beyond borders. I think the COVID crisis also did that very similarly, because as you referenced in your remarks, disease knows no borders. And so I think that what it told us is that we just can't stay locked in our inward-looking single-country strategy. And that's why it was important to explore this area of cross-border collaboration more fully.
What are the most important government innovations that were uncovered in this series?
So it's very hard to answer that question because there were, and every single one of those truly were remarkable and truly were different in their own perspective. But allow me to maybe focus on the ones that I know of, which are the UAE ones, and probably I'll ask Jeffrey to elaborate on some of his favorites. But if I was to look at the one that was probably published in the second report was Surfacing Insights and Experimenting Across Borders. We highlighted the Government Accelerators program in that report, mainly because most cross-border innovations usually don't start with the intent to do cross-border. It starts with the domestic need. And that's exactly what happened with the Government Accelerators program. It was a domestic need to move things faster in the UAE when it comes to the most pressing challenges. How could that also be shared as a knowledge for cross-border collaborations? Because that's even more challenging to do cross-border innovations. How could this platform and methodology work there? And most recently, we signed with the WHO on how we can use the Government Accelerators platform to do cross-border challenges for the WHO as well. And we're at the early stages there, and we're quite excited about that program. The other interesting example came from Europe, which is the CivTech Alliance project. And I think that was purely on climate change. And we noticed a lot of the cross-border innovations tapped into climate change. It brought in around 10 European countries as well as the US, and it enabled 18 climate tech startups to improve accessibility and the impact of their innovations. So those are my two interesting projects that I think came out from there, and I don't know if you had any of your favorites as well.
Well, I would mention the Deep Space Food Challenge, which is an innovative program partnered by Canada and Canadian Space Agency and our NASA in the US, which sort of to foster the ability for further space exploration. How are you going to be able to produce the food astronauts are going to need on these journeys? But if you look back at the history of our space program in the US and see how many innovations came from that space program to help address problems or challenges on Earth, I think something like this also has a great potential to help alleviate food security issues here on Earth. The second one is the Global Innovation Collaborative, which is a platform that sort of looks even beyond the country level and actually looks down at cities and localities and really challenges and invites innovators to compete for funding and deploy their solutions in various areas. Almost, if I go back to look even like in the United States, it's often said that we have state governments and we have the national government, that the state governments are often viewed as sort of the laboratories to test and see what types of collaborations and that work best. So that would be the other one I mentioned.
How is the UAE promoting agility? And if you may share an example of that, what is currently happening in the UAE around agility?
The key thing is agility is the top priority for us as the UAE government as well. And 18 months ago, we embarked on a program of cross-border nature as well. And that program brought in like-minded countries as well to really work together on this topic. And not just work together in terms of a research, but actually do programs. Those countries were UK, Denmark, Italy, Canada, Singapore, and Japan. So 7 nations came together and we formed the Agile Nations. This Agile Nations program was supported by the OECD and the World Economic Forum. And I'm proud to say that this year the UAE won the bid to chair the Agile Nations program, and we will be chairing it for the next year. So what is Agile Nations? It's really about bringing in a regulatory framework together to allow businesses and markets to pilot and trade their programs cross-border, and to open up and scale their businesses cross-border, and to navigate between the different regulatory frameworks of our 7 countries. So we've been doing a lot of interesting things. The main focus that we looked at is in the emerging technologies, because that's where regulation is extremely unclear, and that's where agility is extremely important. So the whole idea is, how do we have agile regulations? How do we promote markets and prosperity, new economic growth in that? Our bid this year will be focusing on 3 main areas. One is the collaborative approach of sharing this platform and sharing these programs with our partners as well. And the second is to look at the new economy. How can we navigate in the new economy, and specifically virtual assets and fintech? And how can we, our regulatory bodies, support cross-border regulations between those areas? And the third one, which I think everybody's curious about, and we have a forum about it dedicated at the summit, is the metaverse. What does the metaverse mean for governments? What does it mean for agility? And what does it mean for regulations and markets? So those are the 3 main areas that we'll be looking at with the Agile Nations program. And I ask everybody who's interested in these topics, from private sector or government, who are keen to be part of this, to please reach out. And we hope to include you as well in the programs. They're actual, tangible programs that we're working with real departments and governments to make change. And I think that's the main thing. Agility is, it's to find ways to have impact and to make change on the ground.